We will go over macromolecules today. This is the first part of topic 6, which is origins of life. These are the standards we will be covering. For those of you who are not part of my class, remember I'm in Miami-Dade County, Florida, so the standards that you cover might look different. These are the objectives associated with the lecture of today. We will be discussing the biological molecules that make up all living things. So we got 4 macromolecules we will be talking about. You have carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. Notice that I am saying macromolecules. Obviously, macro means big. So macromolecule literally means just very large molecules, and they are very large molecules because they are made up of subunits. So macromolecules can be also called polymers, and polymers are just that. They're just very large molecules made up of monomers or smaller molecules, smaller repeating units, and you're going to see an example of that in a little bit. The first macromolecule we're going to discuss is nucleic acids. The nucleic acids are, their main function is to store DNA. They are made up of nucleotides. So the monomer of the nucleic acid polymer is going to be nucleotides, and there are there's 3 main parts to a nucleotide. There's a phosphate, deoxyribose sugar in the case of DNA, and a ribose sugar in the case of RNA, and a base. We're going to talk a lot more about these bases because in this nitrogenous base over here, this is what the code of life is actually built up. So when they talk about genes, when they talk about your genetic code is written basically in 4 letters. And those 4 letters are, they each represent a nitrogenous base. And those nitrogenous bases are what determines what you look like and which proteins your body makes and how you digest food and all of these other things that we will be talking about later in the course. This is a more chemical, a less generalized view of a nucleotide. This was an adenine nucleotide. So you have adenine, guanine, thymine, and cytosine, and those are the 4 nucleotides, the 4 nitrogenous bases that make up DNA. It's really important that you think of them as nitrogenous bases because nitrogenous bases, as you can see, they have a bunch of N's in there. That means that they contain nitrogen. And nitrogen is one of the big things about DNA. It's how you identify it. The other big thing to identify DNA is this phosphate group. So you see the phosphate over here. So DNA has nitrogen, it has phosphate, and like every other organic molecule, it has carbon, it has oxygen, and it has hydrogen. You don't see most of the carbons because in organic chemistry, we know they have carbon. So every like corner here, it's a carbon. But not this one. This one's the nitrogen. That's why we label it. But the ones that are not labeled are carbons. And this is what I was just going over. Like we said, the monomer of DNA is nucleotides. So you see them over here. Again, a monomer is a smaller subunit that makes up a polymer. Next up, we have lipids. Lipids are simpler than nucleic acids. Nucleic acids are extremely complex molecules because they perform that very important function of just sort of storing the instructions of how to make you, how to make a human, how to make a human function. Lipids do a lot of very important things. One of them, or the most commonly heard one, is that they store energy for long-term use. So what does long-term use means? Long-term use means that let's say you have a cheeseburger and a milkshake and a large fries. And all of this is like, you know, 1800 2000 calories, which is a very large amount. So when you have this repeated times, your body doesn't need all the energy you're consuming, so it's going to store it, usually in your love handles or your thighs. So lipids are fats, oils, waxes. Soap and detergents are actually lipids as well. And we're going to see a little bit more examples of that later. But lipids are less complex and they only contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. It's also important that they don't contain these in any particular order. So the monomers of lipids are not actually a macromolecule per se. Like they're not, well, they're macromolecules, but they're not exactly a polymer per se because they have different components. So they're usually composed of like fatty acids and glycerol. And technically that doesn't make it a polymer because polymers should be like just one of them repeated, but they're close enough. Also, the only function that lipids have is not storing energy. They have other functions such as they make up the cell membrane. So this is a depiction of a phospholipid. Phospholipids are the main lipid that makes up the cell membrane. You get just very large layers of these, and that's what the cell membrane is actually composed of. Mainly structure. This is what it's structurally composed of. There's a bunch of other parts of the cell, and those parts are mostly proteins. So these phospholipids are going to form what's called the phospholipid bilayer or a lipid bilayer, and that's just a double layer of phospholipids. So the head of the phospholipids, the little red part, is polar and the tails are non-polar. So the polar part is going to be in contact with water, so that's why it's hydrophilic and likes water. And the hydrophobic tails, which literally means water fearing, they're going to try to stay away from the water, so they're going to face each other in an aqueous water containing environment, and that's going to make your phospholipid bilayer a lot more stable. In fact, it's an extremely stable structure, which is why it's what makes up the cell membrane. Now, there's a bunch of stuff embedded into the lipid bilayer. There's proteins, there's some carbohydrates, there's a bunch of stuff, and that's what actually performs the function. But these are like the bricks that make up the house. This is a closer look at the cell membrane. So just imagine a very large sphere of phospholipid bilayer, and the inside is what the cell actually is. And then the outside is your extracellular matrix, your fluid. So phospholipids are called amphipathic molecules. Amphipathic molecules are molecules that have a polar and a non-polar end. So they can act as polar or non-polar depending on which side you're interacting with, which is pretty cool. It's gonna come in handy a little bit later. We're gonna talk more about this as we progress in the course. Next up, we've got carbohydrates, which is just, you've heard about them a lot. Most people, when you think of carbohydrates, you think of like bread and pasta and all that stuff. But carbohydrates are really just sugars. Way down to its most basic chemistry, carbohydrates are sugars. Which is why when some people decide to diet, they try to cut out carbohydrates because if you cut out the sugar content. Now, this may not be a very smart idea because you might want to cut back on carbohydrates, but you don't want to cut them off completely because carbohydrates is what we use to make energy like on the go. So carbohydrates are sugars, they store energy for short-term use. We're going to grab carbohydrates, specifically glucose, and any carbohydrate that you consumed, your body is going to try to turn it into glucose. This is the big guy. This is the probably one of the most important carbohydrates in your body. Okay, so glucose, like it says here, it's a monosaccharide, and the big long chain. So I said it was probably the most important one. It's not the only one. There's a lot of different carbohydrates in your body, and they perform a lot of different functions. This one's not found in humans, but it is starch. So you've heard about starch. You know that starch is in like potatoes, and all the tubers have a lot of starch, and they do, because starch is how plants store sugar. So they have these really long chains of glucoses, which is what starch is, and they're long straight chains of glucose, and that is how plants store and their energy. They store their glucose there. So whenever the plant needs energy, they're going to break these up, and they're going to turn those glucoses into chemical energy, which is a molecule called ATP, and we're going to see a little bit later. The way we store sugar, it's called in a molecule called glycogen. So it looks a lot like starch, and it's just also a chain of just glucose, but it's a branched chain. So while starch is a straight chain, glycogen is a branched chain. So you have this mess of like a lot of longer or smaller chains coming together, and this is stored in our liver, and we're going to talk about later how this process regulates blood sugar. So this becomes very important for people who have diabetes. And here's here's the bread and all that fun stuff. No, so we use it to make ATP. We already said that. Here's some examples of what a carbohydrate will look like. It is very important that you remember that carbohydrates are rings. So whenever you see just the ring, like just one ring or just a very long chain of rings, that's going to be a carbohydrate. And they are the ones that make rings. So yes, the other ones do have rings as well, because the rings are very stable structures that show up a lot in organic molecules, but carbohydrates are distinct for being just rings. Like it's just one ring, and then there's some stuff attached to it, but that's usually it. Like the main structure, the main thing is a ring. Now, the other really important thing about carbohydrates is that they have a ratio of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So for example, we talked about glucose before. So we said that, and I showed it to you. So glucose has 6 carbons. So you see it over here. You have 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 2 oxygens. So all of these are actually glucose. They're all different ways of drawing glucose. And if you are in the pre-med track, or if you're going to study chemistry or something along those lines, you're eventually going to hit this when you get to college in organic chemistry, and you're going to have a lot of fun with these molecules. Well, I liked organic chemistry a lot, but I'm a nerd, so you guys know that. This is a closer look at ATP. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about this. This formula over here is called cellular respiration, and that is the chemical formula on how we make ATP. So remember, it made out of glucose and oxygen. So you just react glucose with oxygen in a special way, and you produce ATP, carbon dioxide, and water. So whenever you hear that you need oxygen to live, right? Because if you don't breathe in oxygen, you die. You die because you need oxygen to make ATP. If you don't have ATP, if you don't have this molecule, adenosine triphosphate, your whole system shuts down, because the ATP molecule is what serves to fuel all metabolic functions. So if you don't have ATP, then you don't have energy to fuel your metabolism, and you die. That's why you die of asphyxia, of lack of oxygen. Which is pretty cool. So we're going to spend some more time on this formula later, but yes, it is important that you know it at this point. So you're going to react glucose with oxygen to produce carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. And last but certainly not least, we have proteins, which you would probably associate with meat and beans and eggs and all that fun stuff. But proteins are actually everywhere. So your hair on your nails and are made of a protein called keratin, and a lot of your skin contains keratin as well. So that's a different protein. Proteins have so many different functions, and that's why I like to put it usually at the end, because proteins do pretty much everything else. So you have carbohydrates that store energy for short-term use. You have lipids that store energy for long-term use. Then you have nucleic acids that store genetic information. And pretty much everything else that needs to get done in your body is done by proteins in some way, shape, or form, either directly performed or mediated by proteins. So they're extremely important. Since they're so important, they're very complex molecules, and most of the proteins that actually do things in your body are actually what's called holoproteins, or just a complex of more than one protein, and that will be the fourth level of organization. Of a protein, the first level is just all the monomers together. So you have your amino acids that come together to form a long chain of which is called a peptide chain. So they have peptide bonds and they bond together, and it's called a peptide chain because reasons. Then they're going to come and they're going to form what is called the secondary structures, which are your motifs, like your alpha helix or your beta plated sheet or your helix turn helix or whatever. You don't need to worry about this at this point. They just form the secondary structures. They basically they fold in a specific way, or they twist in a specific way, and then the tertiary structure is, so just think tertiary, think 3D, because that's when they get their three-dimensional shape. So they kind of fold themselves in weird ways, and that three-dimensional shape is going to determine the function of that protein. And then the quaternary structure is just like the actual functional structure. It's usually when more than one protein come together. So more than one peptide chain folded and given a two-dimensional shape come together to like actually do something. These are some other functions that proteins have. Again, they have a lot of different functions. So as I mentioned before, there's a bunch of proteins embedded in the cell membrane within that phospholipid bilayer, and you see them over here. The blue or purple things are proteins, and these proteins are going to do a lot of the work of the cell. So for example, you can have channel proteins, which are going to let things in and out of the cell, or you can have proteins that are going to serve for your body to recognize your cells as yours. We're going to talk about those. Topic 14, when we do the immune system a lot. So we're going to talk about the major histocompatibility complex and all of that sexy stuff. But I digress. Right now we're talking about their function as a part of the cell membrane. Again, a lot of the function part of the cell membrane is done by proteins that mediate or actually perform these functions, such as letting things in or recognizing the cell or sending chemical messages, which is often smaller proteins that go through a protein channel and they get sent throughout the body. So proteins are very busy in your body. That's why they always tell you that it's important to eat proteins, to eat things that contain proteins. Because say you eat a steak, which contains a lot of proteins, what your body is going to do, it's going to break down the proteins contained within the steak into the amino acids, and then it's going to use those amino acids to make the proteins that your body needs to make to do whatever it needs to do. Um, Closer look at various functions of membrane proteins. Now, a very big thing that that proteins do is they serve as enzymes. Now, not all enzymes are proteins, but a lot of them are. We're going to talk a little bit more about this in class. But this chart, you're going to see it a lot, so become familiarized with it. I will explain it further in class. But basically, it's just showing the progression of a chemical reaction. So any chemical reaction needs energy to start. Then that energy that the chemical reaction needs to start is called the activation energy, or the energy of activation. That's why it says EA. So this activation energy, the bigger it is, the harder it is to get the energy to the reaction to go to get going. Sometimes, so energy is like, for example, if you heat up something, it has more chances of reacting because the molecules are going to be moving faster and they're going to bump into each other more. So you're providing energy, right? Heat energy, thermal energy, and that's going to make your reaction go faster. That would work to catalyze your reaction, and catalyzing your reaction means just that. It just makes it go faster. So a lot of enzymes work as biological catalysts, and they reduce the activation energy. So when the enzyme is present, the reaction can occur a lot faster. And sometimes it just doesn't occur at all without the enzyme, because it would be so slow that it just doesn't happen at room temperature. Then you're gonna have your reaction, right? You have the spike, so you need a little bit of activation energy. So this is about like half. So it reduced it by half. Just think about coffee. That's the way I usually think about it, as your catalyst. So you guys don't have this problem, or most of you don't, but I'm old. So when I wake up in the morning, I can't human until I have had some coffee. So coffee catalyzes my metabolism, and it kind of kicks it into gear. Just think about that as something that provides that extra boost, that like oomph that you need to get going, and that activation energy. So it reduces the energy that you need to put in yourself by providing either a shortcut or extra energy. Now, this is a suggested class activity. If you're another teacher and you would like to do this activity with your students, just feel free to send me an email, and I will send you the PDF with the activity. My email is on the first slide of the presentation. But I'm kind of going to spoil it, so you might want to pause it now and have your students work on it, and then I'll show the answer. So just to summarize, first up, we got proteins. Your proteins look like this convoluted, messy, three-dimensional stuff, and they perform a lot of different functions in your body, from serving as biological catalysts or enzymes to how the cells communicate within themselves, to the actual message that gets sent from the cells. So the hormones are often proteins. Um, to just ferrying things around and transporting things. Just for example, hemoglobin is the protein within your red blood cells that transports oxygen throughout your body. And we already talked about why oxygen is so important. They are made up of amino acids. They contain, like every other organic molecule, they contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but proteins also contain nitrogen. And here are some examples of proteins. So we talked about keratin. I told you that keratin is what your hair and nails are made up of. Pepsin is the enzyme that breaks. It's a protein. It's an enzyme that breaks down proteins. Haha. So when you eat that steak that we were talking about, pepsin is going to break it down into amino acids, and those amino acids are going to be used for something else. And melanin is a pigment. It's a protein that is a pigment. It's what gives color to your hair, your eyes, your skin. It's a brown pigment that determines the color of all of those things. We have nucleic acids. Nucleic acids are going to store genetic information. So remember, the genetic code that you hear a lot about is made up of this nitrogenous bases. So they're nitrogen containing bases. And that's what holds the instructions to like human to function, not just of what you look like, but actually how your body actually works. So aside from nitrogen, nucleic acids are also going to contain phosphorus, and they are made up of nucleotides, which we already talked about are the ones that contain those nitrogenous bases. Now, fun fact, or not, maybe not so, but the Na and DNA and RNA stands for nucleic acid. So DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid and RNA is ribonucleic acid. So if you ever forget, just think DNA, the Na is a nucleic acid, and it's kind of a trigger, a memory trigger. Next up, we got lipids. So we said that lipids store things for long term, and they are structural parts of the cell membrane. We said that they're made up of fatty acids and glycerol, and we said that they contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in no particular numbers. We talked about phospholipids. Pretty much any oil, like olive oil, vegetable oil, they're all lipids. Wax is also part of the lipid family. Soaps and detergents, we already mentioned this before. And last but definitely not least, we have carbohydrates. And carbohydrates are, again, they're sugars, and sugars are the ones that store energy for short-term use. And oh yeah, actually they can be pretty sturdy, so don't think of sugars as soluble. Not a lot of them are easily soluble. And they can serve as structural parts of certain parts, like plant cell walls are made of cellulose, which is it's a polymer, it's a polysaccharide. And insects and mollusks exoskeleton are made up of chitin, CHITIN, and like here. And that's actually a carbohydrate as well. It's a polysaccharide, and it's pretty tough. So the other thing about carbohydrates is that their carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen are found in that 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. So just remember glucose. You need to know glucose. So glucose is C6H12O2. Sorry, O6. So 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, 6 oxygens. So C6H12O2. 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. That's what it means. This table just summarizes everything we talked about before. And that's pretty much it. Thanks for joining us.